Well, maybe I can just jump in here. Like I said, there are lots of themes that we can tackle. I'm going to offer a short thought this morning. And I think the thing that I mused on as I read this passage was the striking difference between the wisdom and the power of the wilderness and the wisdom and the power of Jerusalem and the Sanhedrin. We all find ourselves sometimes in this place between the things that we hope for and the things that we dream for and the sobering reality of where we actually are. And we find ourselves in need of wisdom in that place. And this passage has left me thinking about how do we deploy wisdom and power in our own lives as we live and lead and disciple. There's something about the way we use wisdom. And I wonder, as we live and lead and disciple, are we in the wilderness with Jesus? Or do we sometimes find ourselves, whether through the hardening of our heart over time or accidentally, over time, colluding with the crowds as we try to neutralize his subversive ways in our lives? That gap between reality and hope, no matter what we're doing, it's a frustrating place to be. Have you ever had this experience? You saw that cake online that you thought was really amazing. You're like, I can totally do that. And you make it and it looks like a melting Elmo in the end. You know, you like to go to the gym. There's some guys here that go to the gym all the time. My brother's going to the gym. You want to be that guy that squats over 400, but you're closer to like 200. And that's frustrating. You plan some vacation that you're super excited about and you get everything packed and you go only to get there and to realize that going on vacation with really little children is actually not glamorous. That gap between reality and hope, it's a really frustrating place to be. Someone was talking to me this week about this show, Homestead Rescue. Has anyone seen it? I had not watched it before, but they were telling me about it. I assume they watch it with their kids. So I was like, I'll get on the train and see what the crazy is about. Let's go watch an episode of it. Homestead Rescue is these people who have decided that they want to live off the grid. So they're going to go find a place in the woods and try to provide for themselves in every single way apart from society. And they usually get themselves in a terrible mess, and they call this family the Rainies to come and rescue them, usually. So I watched this episode about this young city-dwelling couple who, I don't know, the dream, the allure of living off the grid, it got to them. And they bought 21 acres in the middle of nowhere off of Craigslist. And they bought 40 pigs, and they bought 50 chickens, and they took everything they had and they moved out there to try and make a go of it. And as the episode opens, their life is in total disarray because as they dreamed and mused about what it would be like to live off the grid, one of the things that they thought they were going to be really committed to was free-range farming, that these pigs and these chickens that they have would have a better life if they could just roam free in the land. Which means the animals are everywhere and in everything. The pigs were like destroying their sheds. There was basically nothing left of them. Every time one of the female pigs, the sows, had piglets, or even the chickens, they were being eaten by federally protected birds like eagles and hawks, or they were being taken by coyotes and eaten. There's this weird thing that male pigs will do when female pigs are pregnant. They get aggressive with each other. And sometimes if there's too many of them, they get so aggressive, they stress out the pregnant pigs and they lose their babies. And this was happening. I know it was terrible. It was horrible. So they're literally, they haven't dug a toilet for themselves. They just go poop wherever they want to on the land. They tried to build a house and they built it near the tallest, biggest tree that was leaning towards, it was 10 feet from their house and leaning towards it. And that's where they built their house. So they were just out there living the dream, and it wasn't going well for them. They needed help. They were out of money. They needed help. They called the Rainies. The Rainies came out. They surveyed. They're literally standing among decaying pigs and chickens. And the Rainies were like, where did you learn to homestead? And they were like, YouTube and the internet. That's literally what they said. They were like, we learned everything we know from YouTube and the internet. And these like grizzly, like worn homesteaders are just standing there looking at them, with their beards and their guns. And they're like, really? You thought you were going to come out here on the wisdom of okay, I see what we're doing now, His wife said, because they had to take that tree down. So he was asking him, do you have a chainsaw? She's like, yeah, we got one. He learned how to use it off YouTube. And the first time he used it, he cut himself. It fell into his leg when he was using it. But they were committed. They were staying there. They were going to do the thing. So the homesteaders try to convince them, you need to build some pens to protect your pregnant pigs, your piglets. You're not going to be able to survive. You can't, we're literally standing here in decaying corpses. And the guy is like, absolutely not. We will not compromise our value of free range farming. So they have this value that is we want to do what's good for the animals, but all the animals around them are dead, and they're not seeing that these two things are not lining up. They're still determined to trust in the wisdom of the mighty, wise sages of YouTube. The gap between reality and hope can be a frustrating place, and it sends us searching for remedies in need of wisdom and maybe even rescue. And that place, that pressure, that gap between our hopes and our dreams and our realities, it pushes us to make choices. And listening to the wrong voices can lead to dangerous choices. You'll cut your leg off with a chainsaw. Carl Miller talks about there are 3 basic ways that we tend to respond when we experience that disillusionment between our hopes and our dreams and reality. One way that we can respond is that we deny. We're surrounded by dead pigs, and we still say it's not that bad. We have 5 left. We started with 40, but we have 5. It's great. Everything's fine. There's nothing wrong here. Nothing is on fire. We deny, and we try to convince ourselves that our reality is better than it is. Or we despair. We lose all hope. Nothing is good. Nothing will work. Nothing will ever come of this. Or we dig into our own strength, our own power, our own determination, and we try somehow to muster, to make a thing happen that we think should happen. No matter where it comes from, that pressure, it pushes us to choose. And listening to the wrong wisdom can be dangerous. In this passage, we're headed to the climax in this midpoint of John. Every sign in John, from John 2 to John 12, it has the same pattern. A sign is performed or a claim is made about Jesus. He makes it about himself, and it presents some sort of misunderstanding or controversy about him, and people have to make a choice about who he is. And the signs in chapters 1 through 10, they're increasing the controversy around Jesus. And this sign in 11 around Lazarus, it's the greatest sign. It creates the most pressure and the greatest controversy. The revealing of who Jesus is and his ways, it threatens the prevailing power structures. It threatens prevailing authority and prevailing wisdom. But it also reveals a possible way forward, as his miracles point to a new kingdom that's coming. For some, his way is a clear threat to them, and for others is an unexpected source of liberation. And people are, again in 11, they are pushed to make a choice. Either believe Jesus, his power, his wisdom, or preserve self and nation. Trust in their own wisdom, secure their own future by their own means. And there doesn't seem to be much in between those two choices. So Israel is still in this place of their unmet hopes of Messiah coming to deliver them. The crowds see what Jesus does for Lazarus, raising him from the dead, and the crowds, they go to the Pharisees. The Pharisees, they gather the Sanhedrin. They get together, the highest council for the Jewish people, and begin to have this meeting to talk about what are we going to do. There's a crowd element to what is happening. They're stirring one another up, convincing one another, and they choose. They choose to assert their own power, to attempt to save themselves, their temple, and their nation. They choose self-preservation as they issue a warrant and plot to kill Jesus. Listening to the wrong voices in that disillusioning place between our dreams and our reality, it can be dangerous for us. Now, we may not place ourselves exactly with the Sanhedrin. That may be hard for us to envision ourselves like them in this passage. We don't want to place ourselves right with them. But the impact of groups on what we think and how we choose It can be huge, actually, even in simple things. Some of you may have heard before about Ash's conformity experiment. I don't know if you've heard about this before, but there have been a number of social science folks over the years that wanted to explore and test human behavior under the pressure of certain social forces. So they designed these social experiments, and one of them was this guy, Solomon Asch. And he gathered up a group of participants and told them that what they were testing was visual perception. That's what he told them. But he was actually wanting to test what they would do under the pressure of certain social forces. So he put them in a room with a group of other participants in a classroom. And all of the participants in the room, except for one, were in the know. And there was one participant that was a real participant that thought they were there for visual perception, and they were going along with the exercise. So what they would do is they would put these lines up on a screen. You've probably seen this before. And they would go down the line. So the first line is the target line. And he would say they wanted to test visual perception and ask, of the target line, which one matches it, A, B, or C? And so they would line them up, all the people who were in the know, and then the real participant was last. And they would go down the line and say which letter out loud they thought it was. And the first few times they did it, the people who were in the know picked the right line, which in this case is C. So they would go C, 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 and the real participant would be like, yeah, totally, it's C. They would do that 2 or 3 times. And then a few times in, those people who were in the know would start clearly picking the wrong line. And they would go down the line, say their answer out loud, and it would get to the real person. And sometimes they would have a confused look on their face, but they would still say the wrong answer. And as they did this test, and they tested it multiple times, they found that 30% of the time, a real participant would repeatedly say the wrong answer, even if they knew it was the wrong answer, because everyone in the line before them had said the wrong answer. And they found that 75% of time, 75% of every single participant conformed at least once through the test. It was really interesting to me. They interviewed the real participants afterwards, trying to discover why did they conform. And there were different reasons for each of them. Some of it had to do with how many people had said the wrong answer. It really only took 3 to 5 people to unanimously decide on the wrong answer to get the most conformity out of the unsuspecting participant. Sometimes it had to do with self-doubt. So the more difficult the task, or their sense of like, the group must know better than me. So they doubted their own wisdom and would just say it. Sometimes if they sensed in the group that other people had higher social status or power than them, they might be willing to conform more often. And sometimes they said it was just about avoiding conflict. They just wanted to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. So they just chose the path of least resistance and went along with the answer. Groupthink is a strange and interesting thing, and it can be really dangerous. How do we know if we're deploying the wisdom of the wilderness or if we're deploying the wisdom of the crowds? Because we also experience a frustration between what we hope for, what we dream for, and our current reality. We talked about it some last week. We have hopes and dreams for our lives, for our families, for our microchurches, for that friend who's far from God. And yet we're faced with our reality of how hard your marriage is at times, the reality of the choices that your kids make and how tough it is to parent them. The hard stuff that happens in our microchurches, or even the times when it just feels like nothing is happening in our microchurches, or the mess that we make of our own lives or that we watch that friend of ours make of their life. That gap, that tension between what we hope for and what is real, it can be destabilizing. And that instability feels threatening to us when it surprises us or when it persists long enough in our life. And we begin to look and search for remedies, for some kind of wisdom, for some kind of power to exert in that situation. And it is possible, if we aren't careful, for us to end up embracing the wisdom of the crowd. Like cutting ourselves with a chainsaw, we accidentally kill Jesus by rejecting the power and the wisdom of his subversive ways. Whether it's in our own lives or in the advice that we give to those that we lead, We can, over time, find ourselves deploying wisdom that says self-care and self-fulfillment is the way to happiness, rather than the fullness of life and the abundant life comes from laying down our life and from self-forgetfulness. We may deploy the wisdom that says that the way to success is to believe in yourself, in your personal truth, in your strength, in your abilities, over the wisdom that says that kingdom greatness is measured in humility. We deploy the wisdom that says we have the right to protect ourselves, maybe even to retaliate against those who hurt us or harm us, instead of remembering the subversive wisdom that protectionism and violence, they are not God's answers to sinfulness and brokenness in the world. We deploy the wisdom that says people who hurt us in certain ways don't deserve mercy. And we lay aside the wisdom that forgiving our enemies is the way that we show that we belong to the Father. We deploy wisdom that says there's a limit to how many times a person is allowed to wrong us and keep trying. And we lay aside the wisdom that people who truly experience the extravagant grace of God should continue to pass that grace on to others, not 7 times, but 7 times 70. We are surrounded by sages in our time. Every podcast, every comedian, every influencer, they are sharing their wisdom with us, trying to shape the way that we all think in every aspect of our lives, with us and with the people that we serve and that we love and that we're trying to lead. They're trying to share their wisdom about success and about your identity and about health and about our homes and our families and our friendships and our purpose. It could be easy to stop testing that wisdom against the strange wisdom of God. It could be easy to not challenge those that we disciple and that we lead through our microchurches to test that wisdom against the wisdom of the wilderness. And accidentally, we join the masses in silencing the subversive ways of Jesus. As we head to communion this morning, Emily, I don't know if you want to come up. I was just, to revisit what I said earlier about Carl Miller. He says that in hard places between reality, our hopes and our reality, we can deny. We can say that our marriage isn't really that bad, or that sin that we're excusing, it isn't really hurting anyone. We can despair. We can lose all sight of the victory of God that has come for us and that is coming for us. Or we can try to muster our own strength and our own power of self-preservation. And all 3 of those choices are the way of the crowd. The other choice that we have is to find ourselves dwelling in that tension with Jesus in the wilderness. I wonder, how do we locate ourselves with the disciples in this passage? How do we find ourselves with him in the wilderness? How do we help people in our microchurches choose Jesus in the wilderness over the wisdom of the world? Another interesting fact about Ash's study is that as they tested participants, as the study went on, they made one critical change, and they added one more in the no participant as a dissenter. That is, every person said the wrong answer. There was one person in the no who said the right answer. And just adding one ally dissenter into the group caused real participants to say what they knew was true 30 to 80% more often in the study as it was replicated. Your microchurch has the potential to be a powerful ally for people in our city who are beginning to suspect that what the world is telling them about where to find life and identity and success and how to handle their relationships isn't quite right. No matter how small your group is, to say that we don't think it's right either. You cannot underestimate what God can do with that testimony through your small microchurch. So persevere, small microchurch leader. Keep offering an alternative to the wisdom of the world. Another way I think that we can work to find ourselves in the wilderness with Jesus is to double down on those core relationships with the people in our life who want to be in the wilderness with Jesus too. Sometimes we're wrestling through things and we don't know what to do, and we do need wisdom. And I'm not sure if we ask each other for help often enough. Even you as leaders, there are things that you struggle with, whether it's in your marriages or in your relationships or in your parenting or in the things that you're trying to figure out in your microchurch. And sometimes you just swim around those decisions on your own. And I wonder if one way for us to join Jesus in the wilderness is to ask someone. Ask someone to check your wisdom. Bring something to them and say, hey, this is something I'm facing, and this is what I'm thinking, and this is the advice that people are giving me. What do you think about that? What do you think the wisdom of God is? What do you think the wisdom of the wilderness is for me in this place? My guess is that we all have places where we're in need of wisdom, personally and for our microchurches. How do we walk in his other-centered ways rather than bowing to the preservation of our own lives? How do we live and love and labor in response to promises that he has already made and accomplished for us through the cross, instead of striving to ensure a life that we desire or even at times feel entitled to? How do we persevere in serving those that we're sent to when we don't see fruit for a long season, or that brokenness persists and breakthrough doesn't come? How do we root ourselves in his wisdom and power? And I don't know, it could be wrong, guys, but as I was wrestling this week, it seemed simplistic, but I felt like the Lord was saying that part of how we can do that this week is through the place of worship. In this passage, Jesus is in that frustrating gap, disrupting wisdom. He is the most disruptive force of all. He has something to say about our hopes and dreams, about whether or not we should even buy 21 acres off the grid, whether we should try to build a pen or learn how to kill prey. He has something to say about it. And I've often been given the advice that sometimes when we're wrestling through things and we need wisdom, that sometimes going to worship is the first and only task that we have. Not to ask the question, not to seek for the answer, but to find ourselves in a place of worship with Jesus until all of our idols and all of our fears and all of our anxieties, all the ways we've determined to save ourselves and all of our inferior dreams begin to dissipate. To worship until all that is good and just and righteous and beautiful about him eclipses all that is frustrating and uncertain in us and our circumstances. And maybe we need to worship until we get to the point where he could ask us for anything. He could give any command, and we would be ready to say yes to him. And then maybe when we're in that place, ask for that wisdom that you need. From that place of worship and trust and waiting with him in the wilderness. Even though we've celebrated Easter this past week, as we continue to journey through John, he's not done. In the stories we're reading at Passover is beginning. He has isolated himself because they have determined to take his life, but he has determined to give it. He will come out of hiding. He will have his victory over every kind of death through this upside down wisdom of the cross. So I wonder for us this week, how can we increase the worship in our lives as we wait with him in the wilderness? He is at work bringing the victory of God through his self-sacrificing love for us.